How do artists get such realistic drawings of people? Well, a lot of artists use a photo reference, and they either shoot the photo themselves or they find the reference photo online. A lot of artists will draw people in person, but if you don't have access to either of those options, you can use a 3D model. And I'm using a program here called Poser 10. It works really well for generating very realistic looking and very anatomically correct human models. You can customize these models and make them any kind of person, any kind of body type. So I have one particular model here. It's basically one of the default models, and I haven't really customized it other than I've added a pose and tweaked the pose a little bit. But you can literally pose this person however you want. Now, posing does take a little bit of work. It's a little tricky. It's going to take some practice to get the hang of it, but you can see that it's very realistic. So if you ever need a reference of something that's a person, and they even have animals too included in this program, if you need a reference of something, here you have it. You can change the lighting upon the subject, and you could draw from this image as is, or you could view it in different modes like wireframe, or you could do it in cartoon shading to where this would give you a more stylistic appearance. And then you could even do realistic shading. So this is just about as good as having an actual model. And then if you want to actually improve the quality of this to get a better photo to draw over, I'm going to go to Render and Render Settings. And you can change these settings if you like. Auto settings works pretty well. The higher you set this, the longer it's going to take to render, but the better the effects you're going to get. So I'm going to set this to Final. And then I'm going to click down here where it says 640 by 480 because I want a much bigger image here. Let's say 3200 by 2400. Go to OK. This is going to take a while to render, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but we'll click on Render Now. After it's done rendering, you want to save the render by clicking on this triangle here in the top right corner and choose Export Image. And for the file format, we'll go ahead and just save it as a PNG. And if we open it, we can see that we have a pretty decent looking render. If we go full size, you can see it's a pretty decent job. Now, it doesn't look super realistic, but this is a good enough of a model for you to be able to do a drawing with and be able to have an accurate representation of a human. We'll have to improve it a little bit. We're not going to trace this exactly, but we're going to use this as a foundation to do our drawing. So I've gone ahead and opened this image in Corel Painter, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all and copy and create a new canvas. And I'm going to make this a specific size because this render is just whatever size it rendered at. So I'm going to think about how I want to print this, and maybe eventually I want to print this at 11 by 14. So I'm going to set my dimensions to that, and I'm going to paste that image in. Now, if that image comes in too big or too small, I can resize it. So I'm going to choose Free Transform and hold Shift while I scale this up until we get something like that. Click the check to commit, and we'll move it down. The top of the head got cut off, but that's okay. We could go ahead and fill that in. And maybe we could crop this a little bit tighter by making the subject bigger. So I'm going to choose Free Transform again. We'll go with something like this. Now let's go ahead and name our layer so that we know what it is. We'll call it Reference. And we will turn down the opacity of that layer. We'll create a new layer, put it below it, and we'll call it Sketch. Now you're going to say, well, this is just tracing, and you're right. We are going to use this as a guide to create a sketch, but if you know anything about drawing, you know that although the sketch is important, it's only a small fraction of what it takes to be able to do a realistic painting. You have to know a lot about shading and color, the anatomy of the human body, and so on. So even if you sketch this thing and trace over this, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a good looking result unless you know how to draw. So I can draw a human body from imagination without using a reference. I don't feel bad about tracing here because it's going to save me time. You can decide how you feel about it. If you think tracing is cheating, don't do it. Go ahead and freehand draw this. But otherwise, if you don't care, then just go ahead and trace this like I'm going to do here. So I'm going to use the detail oils for that. And I'm going to make the brush smaller. And I'm going to sketch in here using this as a guide. If you have trouble seeing your reference, you can always turn up the visibility a little bit. I like to keep it kind of dim. It's really up to you how you want to do it. Now up here I'm going to have to use my imagination and decide how high the head should go. And even though you have this model here and you can trace over it, you still have to make these stylistic choices to decide how you're going to illustrate this. If you make it look too much like the model and you copy the model too much, it's just going to look like a 3D model. You have to apply your own unique touch and your own unique style to this. I'm going to wait on the pupils, and I'm maybe going to change the position of the eyes. So I'm going to wait on the pupils and the iris. Fine with this eyebrow position here. But of course you could change the eyebrows to a different expression if you wanted to. You can do that in Poser, or you can do it here just by redrawing it. If it helps to zoom in, feel free to zoom in. We'll do that here on the mouth. Now I can draw the same face from imagination because I know where all these parts are, I know how big they're supposed to be, and I know the spatial relation on the face. If you practice using these models, by tracing over this, you'll start to get a better feel for all of the facial features by tracing over them. So don't think about this as cheating. Think about this as a way to educate yourself about human anatomy. Because if you don't, you're going to have to look at photos, you're going to have to look at people, you're going to have to do something to make those observations. Why not make those observations while you're practicing your skills at drawing? And tracing, believe it or not, is a really good way to build your hand-eye coordination for doing digital painting freehand. So don't feel like it's cheating, just do it and just have fun with it. If somebody asks you if you freehand drew this, don't go and tell them that you did, because that would be cheating. But you might want to ask other artists, other portrait artists, what they do, because you'd be surprised to know that a lot of people will use some sort of grid or some sort of form of measurement or tracing, like a projector, to go ahead and just trace over a model like this. Now it isn't because they can't draw freehand. Pretty much all of them can draw freehand. It's that when you're an artist and you work for money, you have to deal with the people who are paying you money, and they don't want to pay you a whole ton of money to take a really, really long time to do the same drawing that you could do if you just traced over a photo. And really, you can't get very far just tracing. It's going to show in your work that you can only trace because you're going to have this lack in subject matter of things that are from your imagination. Everything's going to look traced if it is traced. So you do have to be able to make things up that don't exist. I've had a lot of projects where people want me to paint something and there's no reference photo for it. There's no way I can get a reference photo. I might be able to get something close from a similar angle or multiple photos to study, but for the most part I have to freehand draw all that stuff. But having this experience here with people and having traced over photos and having made these observations makes me really confident in painting people. You know, I can just do it intuitively rather than having to rely on the reference. And with a little bit of practice you'll get to that point too. So again, this is a good way to build up those observations. Now, I don't like the way that the breasts rendered here, so I'm just going to make them a little bit smoother. Maybe I'll have them come in more like that. You can feel free to make these changes however you like. Now, you'll notice there's no nipples here. You know, there's settings on this to keep it a little less racy. So you can add the nipples if you want yourself, or you can set them to render with your model here when you render it. That's up to you. I'm hoping that this video isn't going to get me in any trouble with anyone because of the nudity, but we'll have to see what happens there. So I'm trying not to push my luck. Now here it seemed to render kind of strange, so I'm going to go ahead and fix that to where it looks better to me by eye. So you can't always rely on this model 100%. You have to see where it gets a little kinked sometimes. You know, not all models are going to respond perfectly to each pose that you select, and so they will get bent in a few places. Alright, now let's hide our reference layer by clicking on the eyeball, and you can see we have a sketch here. Now we can further refine this. If we don't like the way it looks, we can change it a little bit. Might polish it up a little bit around here, because you want it to look good by eye, and that even goes for reference photos. Like, you don't always have to copy your model, even if you do it from a photograph. You can always make changes just to make things more balanced. So now at this point, I don't really use this reference. I mean, I could go by the lighting that's on it right now, but I usually want to do my own lighting based on the composition that I'm painting this into. So at this point, this reference can just get deleted, and you're going to see that, yeah, we traced this, but that's not going to help us much if we can't figure out how to shade this and figure out how to fit it into an environment. See down here, the arms don't look that good to me. I'm going to go ahead and fix those a little bit too before we move forward. It looks better to me. I'll widen the arm a little bit there. So when you're tracing, sometimes you don't always get a perfect trace. You gotta fix it up a little bit. So we have our guide now. Let's go ahead and fill our canvas with a gray color. Let's fill it with a number 4 value. We'll choose fill, click on OK. We'll go ahead and create a new layer, and let's call this dark, and we'll go ahead and make it a multiply composite method. We'll choose a number 6 value, and we can go ahead and start shading this now, however we like. Now at this point, I'm not looking at that model or that reference. I'm just going to shade this based on instinct. And there is kind of a logic to things when you're shading. You want to think about where your light's coming from. So let's say our light is coming from the top left over here. We can even draw it in with a little image there. So that's our light, and we want our shadows to be on the opposite side from our light. So that's what I'm doing on this dark layer here. I'm filling in these shadows appropriately. You want to think of all of these forms as being different three-dimensional objects that are all kind of merged together. And if it helps, go ahead and use Poser to study those 3D models and move the light around and see how it interacts with those 3D shapes. That'll give you a really good idea of how to shade things. It's all about observation. Really good artists don't just know things. They took the time to make the observation. And that goes beyond just looking at something and thinking that you understand it. You have to really, really comprehend it until you do understand it and go, okay, I really start to see when I look at people this certain contour around their eyes. You know, there's this roundness where their eyeballs kind of bulge out under their eyelids there. You know, things like that keep your eyes from looking flat when you're drawing eyes. There's shadows from the eyelid on the eyes. The eyes are reflective. You know, you have to know all these things, and it takes a lot of drawing people to get to a point to where you're comfortable making these decisions on your own. Until then, you can just use your reference model or reference photo. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what a lot of the old masters did. They would have people sit for them. They didn't have cameras, but they certainly used models of people to do their realistic illustrations. You can't expect that all of the best realistic portraits and scenes with a lot of people in them were all drawn from imagination. They had people come out and pose for that stuff. So, you know, you might not have that luxury. This model here is just as good. So go ahead and add a shadow now. Light's coming from top left, so Shadow from our head's going to be cast facing away from that. And we'll zoom out. Start putting in some broader shading now. The arms are cylinders. Shade them appropriately. The torso is kind of a cylinder. The breasts are spheres. Alright, so I've finished adding in my shading. I used a few different levels of dark gray here to give it some depth. I'm going to create a new layer and call it light. We want to make sure the gray that we use is lighter than our background, so let's choose a 3, and we'll use the airbrush to go ahead and paint in some lighter gray on our highlight side. On the nose, that's usually one of the brightest parts of the body. So are the lips. Don't worry about this being a little sloppy because we can blend this too later. So I'm just going to go in and continue adding in these light grays. Alright, so I've finished adding in all of my light colors. And now I'm going to create another new layer. Let's call this highlight. This is going to be just a few spots where we use absolute white. Those are going to be put in with the scratchboard tool so they're nice and sharp. Very small brush to put in some reflective spots on the eyes. Do that on the lip as well, and on the tip of the nose. Let's go ahead and put in a basic background. Let's go to the canvas layer, and we'll go ahead and go to the number 7 gray value. We'll go to fill, click on OK. It's going to look a little strange, but we can fix this. We will create a new layer. Let's call it mid. We'll select a number 4 gray value and just use the airbrush to go ahead and fill in the center here. As much as you like. You could keep a little bit of that shadow if you like it. Go back to our light layer, and we'll just use the eraser to clean up some of this area that we overpainted. Go to the mid layer. If you see anywhere you overpainted there, go ahead and fix that. So it pays to be a little careful when you're painting. There's a little bit there on the arm too that we need to shave off. If there's anything on your dark layer that you overpainted, clean that up as well. So I think that looks pretty good. We do want it to look a little sloppy so it looks like a painting. Let's go back to the canvas layer, zoom out. Let's further establish our lighting. So we have our little dot here that's going to be our light. So let's use that white color with a big airbrush to give a more realistic sense of lighting. We'll use black outside the edge there. So we want a nice transition like this. Add a little more white so we give this more of a halo with a smaller brush. So that's looking a little more realistic now. Let's add more dark in the corner here too, like there's a shadow being cast from the body. And a vignette to draw the focus in towards the subject. So it's up to you if you want to keep adding layers. At some point I get kind of fed up with having so many layers to deal with and having to switch back and forth, so I like to just do a drop all. Let's go ahead and do a little bit of blending with the diffuse blur blender. Be careful not to destroy all of your nice fine detail. You just want to blend out some of these transitional areas here, just to smooth the color out. Alright, so blending really helps. If you overblend and you want to sharpen some things, you can use the pinch brush. Let's do that on the shoulder here. I'm going to paint with the brush along the edge to smooth it out and sharpen it. You can do that anywhere you want, really. You don't want this to be too sharp, though. So you want it to look like a painting still. But this adds a little bit of sharpness and balances out the contrast. It smooths out some of the lines and contours. Just be careful where you use it, because it can pull things that you don't intend to pull. So use a smaller brush where you need to get in tight. Use a large brush where you have a lot of room to just paint and you don't have to worry about other things getting in your way. Like here, for instance, this is a very tricky area. If I start painting here, I start to pull in some of the arm and I start to pull in some of the rib cage. So that's an area where I want to use a smaller brush and stay focused on particular areas. There's some places here you'll just have to clean up manually. So you can use the airbrush, hold Alt to sample that dark color, just manually correct that by painting in however it's supposed to be painted. And then we'll blend a little more. A lot of this is going to be back and forth, adding, subtracting, blending, sharpening. It's a back and forth process. You'll notice I keep making a lot of different changes, and that's just because I'm trying to get it looking right. I'm doing this from imagination, so that makes it a little bit harder to be certain about how you're going to leave everything. Sometimes it's easier to create new layers for things like lightening and darkening. So for instance, I could lighten a whole bunch of this, like so, and then change the composite method to screen. That'll make sure that only white shows up and any black disappears. That way if I paint with black, I can conceal some of that white there that I put in. You can also turn down the layer opacity to get a more subtle blend. So you can see that's just brightening it up a little bit. Let's name this light, or lighten. We'll create a new layer, we'll call it darken. That'll be a multiply composite method. That's the opposite of screen. So if we paint with a dark color, like a dark gray, we can balance out the dark a little more. And then painting with white on a multiply layer, we'll erase that dark color that you put down. So it's okay if you overpaint, because you can go through and just erase what you don't need. And you can of course blend on those layers. When you're done doing that, go ahead and drop all again. Just smoothed out the arm a little bit there. I think that looks better. Let's go ahead and add some hair to this person here. We'll create a new layer and we'll call it hair. And let's use a number 7 gray value. We'll select the chalk. You want to use these paper settings that I have here. Let's set the composite method from default to multiply. That way we'll be able to see what we're doing a little bit better there. Let's select a lighter value like this number 2. Put some highlight on the highlight side. We'll go ahead and use the diffuse blur to blend that a little bit. Very lightly. Until it looks like hair. Short hair, short curly hair. And if you want, you can continue adding hair. If you didn't do enough, you can lower the hairline if you want. And of course you want to blend that again. Let's go ahead and drop all again. Let's select white. Use that same chalk brush to add a highlight to the hair. Blend that with diffuse blur. And we'll zoom out a little bit and see how we're looking. Let's go ahead and add a skin color here. And this tint has a habit of over darkening, so you can just reduce the opacity a little bit until you find a blend that you like a little bit better. Let's create another layer. Let's call this red tint. This will be some reddish hues that we'll put in. Now, once we've already gone ahead and kind of filled in this basic shape, we can leverage that by getting a selection from that. So we'll select the tint layer, we'll choose select layer content. See how we get that nice selection around the whole thing? We can use that to make sure that we don't paint outside of that again. So we'll go back to the red tint layer. Let's choose a show hide marquee to hide that selection while still keeping it active. We'll make sure the red tint layer is set to multiply. We'll pick a reddish color, and we'll use the airbrush. So there's usually red around the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. The cheeks sometimes, because there's all your blood vessels underneath the skin. So just here and there, I'm just adding a little bit of red flavor. Let's try some other colors. Let's choose like a more peachy orange color and put in a little bit of that. We don't want the skin to be just one flat color. We want it to have some variance to it. Let's add another layer. Let's call this blue tint. Same thing. It'll be a multiply composite method. We can select a blue hue and we can put some blue tint on this body. Let's zoom out so we can see the whole thing. So we'll do a pretty big overall blue cast on one side. If you overdo it, you can always turn down the layer opacity for that layer to where it has just a little hint of blue. Let's create a new layer. Let's move it underneath the tint layer. Let's call it lighten. Let's return to the canvas layer. Let's create a new layer. Let's call it BG color. That's short for background color. We'll want that to be a multiply composite method. We'll want to invert our selection, so we'll go to select, invert. That turns the selection inside out, so it's selecting the background now. And we could put in a background color. Let's say a dark blue. We'll choose fill. See if we like that color. If not, we can try something else. I think something like that looks good. So now we have an environment color. Let's create a new layer. Let's call it reflection. And we'll go to select, invert selection to turn it right side out again. And then here and there we'll put in some reflections on the skin that are reflecting the color from the background. Let's add a layer. Let's call this highlight. And we'll sample this brown color from the skin, make it a little bit lighter. And we'll bring back some of our highlights. Alright, so I've added a little more detail. Of course, I added some iris and pupils here and a little bit of skin texture. I created a new layer for the skin texture, made it a multiply composite method, and I used red and blue with a sponge to tap in some texture. And what that looks like is little blood vessels under the skin. You just want to tap over the whole thing with red and blue, like so. Here and there and everywhere. Switch to blue, add a little bit of blue. And then turn down the opacity of that layer until it's a very subtle blend. If I zoom in, you can really see this nice texture here. So now this ends up being a little bit too dark since we've been adding a lot of multiply layers. So let's do a drop all, and let's go ahead and brighten this up a bit. To do that, we'll need to duplicate our artwork. So we'll go to select all, copy, and paste in place. That creates a duplicate of our artwork on a new layer. And then we'll choose Effects, Tonal Control, Equalize. Click the Auto Set button. Click on OK. And then you can reduce the layer opacity for that layer if it's too strong. I think something like that looks good. You can also add a layer mask to that layer and then paint with black and the airbrush to conceal some of that brightening. I'll do that here along the side and along the edges. We'll go to drop all. We can also do a select all, copy, paste in place, and just change the composite method to screen. That has a similar effect of lightning. Let's add a mask to that, and let's fill the mask with black. Now we can use white with the airbrush to go ahead and paint in some light here. And you can of course turn down the opacity of that layer as well. You can see that helps quite a bit. Let's go ahead and do drop all again. Let's do select all, copy, paste again to create another duplicate. And let's go to effects, focus, soften. And we'll choose a setting, I guess like this here, around 20. Click on OK. Let's add a mask to that layer. And we'll use black with the airbrush to mask out some of that blur. So we'll keep a little bit out of focus. Like the body can be pretty out of focus. And we'll keep the face in very sharp focus. So if I zoom in, you can see we have this nice photographic effect with the edges here. We can switch to white and we can paint back some of that blurring if we want to go along the edges here. The edges are moving away from you in three-dimensional space, so those edges should be a little bit blurrier. Anything that's too sharp you can blur. We'll blur the eyes a little bit. Let's go ahead and do drop all again. We'll create a new layer. Let's change it to a multiply composite method. Let's select a dark blue like this, kind of a medium dark blue, and we'll go to fill. And we will use white with the airbrush. This works kind of similar to the mask. To go ahead and airbrush out some of this. That helps draw the focus towards the subject. We'll create a new layer. Let's make it a screen composite method. And let's select white, use the airbrush, go and paint along the edge here to add a little bit of an edge glow. Let's create another new layer. Let's make it an overlay composite method. Let's just pick kind of a random color here and choose fill. And we can get some very interesting effects here. Let's maybe shift that more towards orange. Try that. Let's add a mask to that and play around with some of this here. So what we can do is mask out some of this background here, and reduce the opacity. So we get kind of an interesting tinting effect that's warming it. Looks kind of interesting. Let's create another layer. Set that to overlay as well. Let's pick another color. We'll do something like this, and we'll choose fill. We'll mask out some of that using black in the airbrush. And reduce the layer opacity. This just gives everything a little bit of flavor. Go ahead and drop all. Now I could probably keep working on this for a few more hours, but this isn't going to be a tutorial in like ultra realism, so I think I'm going to stop right around here. But let's take a look at how to do the final steps. So it's always good to flip your canvas. Some artists flip their canvas horizontally, some flip vertically, some do both. If you go to canvas, rotate canvas, flip canvas, you can flip it. By flipping it, you get a fresh perspective, and it helps you see anything that's really off. So if you happen to notice that the eyes are really unbalanced, or one's bigger than the other, or something is really off, go ahead and fix it. Like this breast looks a lot smaller than this one, which is fine because that's how it is for some people. But let's go ahead and try to balance that out a little better. We could use the Bulge Brush and go ahead and make that a bit broader to balance it out. Like so. Use the Bulge Brush here on the face to balance out the nose. It'll just kind of push it in a bit, like so. if we wanted to be smiling more, we can push the corner of the mouth up a little bit. So anywhere you want to make adjustments, you can do that. You can use the pinch brush if you want to make the nose thinner on the bridge there. And when we're done balancing things out, we can go ahead and flip the canvas back, or you could leave it this way. Sometimes I'll wait till the very end to flip things and then just leave it flipped because I've looked at it so long one way that having it flipped the other way makes it feel like a fresh piece. But in this case, I think I like it better flipped this way. It just looks better to me. So there you go. That's how you can paint a realistic person using a poser model. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends. And don't forget to click the subscribe button to get updates when I release new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.